Good morning to those on the East Coast. Good afternoon or other time, to others in other time zones. I'm Jane Harmon, the president and CEO of the Wilson Center, former member of Congress, and really proud to bring you the kind of programming the Wilson Center is doing during our long period, the world's long period of enhanced telework or certainly disruption by the coronavirus. Since March, the Wilson Center has organized countless events that have assessed the impact of COVID-19 in every part of the world. What sets our conversations apart is that they not only analyze the medical and economic impact, but also look at how this pandemic will bring systemic change to societies and governments across the globe. These events are a main reason why the center, and I'm very proud of this statistic, has been voted by our peers as #1 in regional expertise for 3 years in a row. And today, I'm proud again to introduce yet another event of this high caliber. With a focus on Africa, we're taking a look at how the pandemic and resulting lockdowns have resulted in a massive shift online for many, not all, many private and public sector activities, resulting in some good news, but also in the flip side, which is many left behind. This event is co-hosted by our Africa program and Ovamba Solutions, a global trade and finance technology company that especially serves Africa's unbanked and underbanked. It's a problem in the US too. I was just discussing it with Mande Myangwa, but it's a big problem in Africa. In some parts of Africa, where internet connectivity and the digital economy had already been spreading, pandemic has only accelerated the transformation. In Kenya and Ghana, governments have worked with private sector operators to waive fees on some mobile money transactions. In South Africa, the government is using a WhatsApp chat box to combat fake news and provide accurate information about COVID-19. And in Uganda, market vendors are using apps to facilitate fruit and vegetable deliveries, avoiding crowded marketplaces. That's really cool. Just let me say that again. In Uganda, market vendors are using apps to facilitate fruit and vegetable deliveries so they can avoid crowded marketplaces. But in many other parts of the continent, hundreds of millions of people, often the most vulnerable populations, still lack access to affordable, good quality internet connections and digital services. An estimated 86% of workers in Africa are part of the informal economy, which means millions of Africans rely on in-person interactions to earn a living, buy essential goods, attend school, or access public services. To help us better understand Africa's digital transformation and how it is being shaped by the COVID-19 pandemic, we are joined today by Viola Llewellyn, co-founder and president of Ovamba Solutions. Thank you for co-sponsoring this event with us. Musa Jimo of the Central Bank of Nigeria, Tim Kelly of the World Bank Group in Kenya, Kennedy Mubita of Standard Chartered Bank, Mukhtar Yadali of the African Union Commission, and the Wilson Center's very own, and my dearest of dearests, Meg King, Director of the Science and Technology Innovation Program. Introducing our speakers is the fierce, and moderating the discussion is the fierce and peerless Mande Myangwa, Dr. Mande Myangwa, the masterful director of our Africa program. Special thanks to you, Mande, and your team for your hard work and excellent programming in these difficult times. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Myangwa.
Thank you, Congresswoman Harmon. I wish to join Congresswoman Harmon in welcoming all of you to this event on digitizing Africa's economy. As she mentioned, my name is Mande Myangwa and I lead the Africa program at the Wilson Center, and I'm going to serve as the moderator for today's event. I thought Congresswoman Harmon did a fantastic job of laying out the backdrop against which today's discussion is going to be taking place. To all of you, we will be live tweeting today's event and we'll be taking questions online and via email. If you would like to ask a question to any of our panelists, please tweet your questions and tag Africa Up Close and use the hashtag @COVIDAfrica, all one word. You may also email your questions to africa@wilsoncenter.org. So as Congresswoman Harman just said, today's event is focused on Africa's digital transformation in the context of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Digitization, simply put, is a mass adoption of connected digital services by consumers, enterprises, and governments. This issue has emerged in recent years as a key driver for economic growth, job creation, and development, all of which are sorely needed across many parts of the African continent. Like other regions, Africa has embraced the promise of the digital economy, for it is now understood that it is not a choice, but an imperative if the continent is to realize its full development potential. In recent years, the continent has made quite a bit of progress in digitizing the continent, including the African Union's digital transformation strategy, about which we'll hear later, and all the other examples that Congresswoman Harman has already highlighted for us. But despite this progress and potential, the current COVID-19 pandemic has made clear the urgency for the continent to accelerate these efforts. For it has exposed or highlighted the significant challenges and divides that still exist in many African countries when it comes to the digital space. So our discussion today will focus on the current state of economic digitization in Africa, highlight some of the key challenges that COVID-19 has exposed, but more importantly, our speakers are going to help us look beyond COVID-19 and offer some recommendations on some of the key measures and actions that various actors in Africa and Africa's international partners could take and should take to accelerate the digitization agenda. To help us speak to these issues, we have assembled 6 excellent speakers and panelists from the public and private sectors, and we've asked each of them to speak to different dimensions of the economic digitization as it relates to Africa. We've asked each speaker to offer 5 minutes of opening remarks on the topic that we've asked them to speak to. Let me start with our first speaker, Mr. Mokhtar Yadali, who is head of the Information Society in the Africa Union Commission. In that capacity, he has led the formulation and adoption of several policies related to ICT, including the African Union Convention on Cybersecurity and Personal Data Protection, and the Africa Union's Digital Transformation Strategy. Mr. Yadali, could you kick us off by giving the big picture overview of the current state of digitization in Africa, what we have learned about digitization in Africa as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, and also speak a little bit about the African Union's key initiatives for addressing this issue at that big picture strategic level, and then offer a couple of recommendations on the key actions and measures that African governments and their partners should take to advance the digitization agenda. Mr. Yadali, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mon, and it's an honor and a pleasure to be here today. I would like first to start by wishing to everybody safety, specifically on these difficult days. And what you have just asked me as actually is so interesting and so wide. That's 5 minutes of time will not allow me to say everything I wanted to say. However, given the fact that we have to share time, I will just go ahead and start responding to some of those questions you have raised. By saying, first of all, that digital transformation, i.e. the mainstreaming of ICT in all socioeconomic development sector, and applying new technology to radically change processes, citizen experience, and value is, as said before, a driving force for innovative, inclusive, and sustainable growth in Africa. For Africa, the current moment is a really leapfrogging opportunity And our leadership in Africa have recognized that and decided to adopt and implement as soon as possible the digital transformation strategy. This strategy is actually based on 4 fundamental pillars that probably are key for the digital transformation of the continent. Number 1 is the enabling environment and policy regulations. Government have to have the responsibility to create an enabling environment with policy and regulation that promote digital transformation. Unfortunately, most of our African member states are not ready from regulatory and policy point of view for issues like artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, machine to machine, 5G, and which are mainly actually really helping to drive the digital transformation. Then the second one is the digital infrastructure. In Africa, unfortunately, despite the growth and the acceleration we have in the mobile sector, unfortunately, nearly more than 300 million Africans lives more than 50 kilometers from the fiber and cable. As the team has, and the team and his team has provided a year ago, sometimes ago, I mean, it is estimated that every 10% increase in broadband penetration in a low and middle income countries result in an increase of 1.38 of the GDP. And you can see that Africa is still really under that margin. Now, the third element is digital skills. Unfortunately, most of our people so far are not really digitally savvy, and specifically when it comes to our leadership and within the government and the administration and so on. Africa still have the lowest literacy in the world, and hence same thing is happening within the digital space. And the fourth pillar will be the digital and innovation entrepreneurship. Africa has more than 400 technology hubs in 93 cities and in 42 countries. More than 130 new hubs have opened over the last 2 years, and they have generated or raised more than 1.1 billion USD. But still, a lot of our young people still don't have access to those opportunities to be really creative. All this would not happen properly if we don't address the issue of cybersecurity. In fact, the matter of cybersecurity, as it has been said recently, has been dramatically increased, specifically in the COVID-19 conditions. Attacks are coming and ransomware are happening everywhere. And our recent statistics has shown that less than 20% of our countries do have cybersecurity strategy or cybersecurity legislations, don't have CERT and CERT, and don't have real sound policy on personal data protection. While in fact, the use of internet has enhanced as has been said by the World Economic Forum by 50%, which is actually really affecting the resilience of our network. With those few remarks, I will have to stop here, but believe me, I haven't said half of what to say. And thank you very much, and over to you.
Off to a great start, talking about the opportunities that digitization offers Africa to leapfrog in terms of development. You talked about some of the key areas that are lagging that need to happen about creating the enabling environment within countries so that we can take full advantage of the opportunities that exist in this space. You talked about the fact that policies are lagging and regulatory frameworks are lagging in many African countries. You talked about the lack of cybersecurity strategies in African countries. I mean, 20%, only 20% of African countries having cybersecurity strategies is a shock to me. But those are all important issues that I think should add value to our discussion today. But you also talked about the potential, the 400 tech hubs in 93 African cities that you talked about. Those offer a tremendous opportunity, and youth engaging with those opportunities, how we facilitate that. So thank you so much for that great start to our programming. Let me now turn to Dr. Tim Kelly, who is Lead ICT Policy Specialist for Transport and ICT at the World Bank based in Kenya. He previously served as head of strategy and policy unit at the International Telecommunications Union, and he specializes in the economics of information and communication technologies. So Tim, turning over to you, just continuing on this big picture stuff, could you provide a quick overview of some of the major actions and initiatives that are being taken to address some of the gaps and challenges that Mukta just raised? And could you tell us specifically what the World Bank is doing in this area, especially with regard to digital access and the Digital Moonshot Initiative collaboration with the African Union? Also, from your view, what are the 2 to 3 impactful measures that can and should be taken to really advance this agenda? Tim, over to you.
So thank you, Monday. Good morning to you and our listeners in America, and good afternoon to those of us who are in Africa. It's clear that the coronavirus pandemic is changing the way we work, changing the way we do business, changing the way we live. And one of the oddities so far is that Africa is relatively untouched. I think globally, something like 75 to 80% of the cases, the infections that we've seen worldwide, are in high-income countries, which is quite unexpected. But that won't continue for long. We're already seeing the first impacts of coronavirus in Africa. In Ethiopia, for instance, where infections have been running at sort of a handful of cases each day, today the number of infections has risen to 25, and clearly it's going to grow a lot faster, particularly as the level of testing increases. And it's clear that Africa will struggle to implement some of the measures that have been used successfully elsewhere in the world. For instance, social distancing, physical isolation. In many African cities, many African marketplaces, that's just not possible at all. But that's why I think a digital response to the coronavirus epidemic is so important for Africa. It's an area where Africa can learn from the rest of the world, and an area where Africa has, as was said earlier, the chance to leapfrog through its digital transformation. In terms of what we've been doing at the World Bank to respond to the pandemic, I think there are 3 broad priorities in what we're doing in terms of managing technology and responding to it digitally. The first of those would be to make sure that the internet continues functioning, increasing the bandwidth that's available, particularly to government, trying to reduce the level of congestion that we experience on networks. We've seen globally an increase in internet traffic of more than 30% just since middle of March. And in some countries, the spike has been as high as 60%. So clearly we need to do good network management to control that, to make sure the internet stays available. One example of that would be South Africa, for instance, making available high demand spectrum on a short-term basis to operators. A second priority, I think, is keeping business continuity and government continuity, and that also links to improved public welfare, ensuring that public welfare continues to be met. So, for instance, a lot of governments are trying to facilitate home-based work. We've had a lot of requests to assist governments in providing key workers with data bundles to help them stay online, providing communications rooms to ministries, as we've done in a number of countries, notably in Somalia. And we're also seeing demand to help the poorest, where the impact of the coronavirus is often the most difficult to bear. Here in Kenya, for instance, the government and Safaricom has lifted mobile money transactions, or lifted the levy on mobile money transactions below $10 to ease the impact on the poor. And a third area, I would say, is to use fintech to support businesses and communities. So to accelerate the introduction of mobile money where it's not already been introduced, and to indeed accelerate the use of financial payments as a substitute for cash payments. The World Bank, as you may have seen, has committed something like $12 billion to a coronavirus response in the short term. And by the short term, I mean between April, where we first started making grants and credits available to countries, and June, which is the closing date for our financial year. So $12 billion committed to in 3 months will be a remarkable achievement. But beyond that, we're already starting to plan for the new financial year and the new round of the IDA cycle, the International Development Association cycle, which will see the commitments grow. In terms of commitments in the telecommunications sector, we are already introducing new programs to assist countries with the coronavirus response, and we're adapting existing ones. So for instance, in Niger, we have a program on smart villages. We're adapting that to prioritize internet traffic to the health sector. We're adapting it to prioritize assistance to government officials that are doing health working. Similarly, in Somalia, we've received a request from the government for an additional 80 communications rooms, and we've received a request to assist the parliament in bringing in remote working using Zoom, incidentally, just as we are today, to allow parliamentarians to meet and to indeed vote electronically. So the World Bank is engaged in a number of different areas of the sort of short-term response to coronavirus. And in the longer-term response, our commitment is to what's sometimes called the Digital Africa Moonshot, a commitment of over $100 billion between now and 2030, with the goal of achieving universal broadband access within Africa. Now, most of that commitment will come from the private sector, but the World Bank, as a major donor and lending agency, together with our other development partners, such as the African Union, the African Development Bank, will also be making commitments on fulfilling that $100 billion commitment. So I think with that, I'll sign off my 5 minutes and hand on back to you, Monday. Thank you.
Touched on a number of really important points there. The ones that stood out for me is the importance of the internet continuing to function. And I think as an add-on to that, I think there's also the importance of ensuring that the internet is not politicized in the sense of the internet shutdowns that we've experienced in a number of African countries over the last couple of years or so. I think that's an issue that also needs to be addressed. You talked about business continuity, and I think that is very important. And I do hope that as we talk about business continuity, we're also thinking about education continuity. I can only imagine the number of African children where we already had issues with access to education, alongside some quality issues as well, what this COVID-19 is going to do in terms of their ability to continue educating Africa's youth and children, particularly in the rural areas. And so what's the educational continuity plan over the long term? That's one of the issues that I hope we would look at. You talked about the use of fintech. I think that's really, really important, and I'm glad that you're focused on that. And then the long-term strategy on the digital African moonshot, and the private-public partnership is what I hear you saying. And I'm hoping in the Q&A we will discuss what that private-public partnership looks like and what the opportunities might be for collaboration in that space. So thank you very much, Tim, for that. So we've looked at the big picture in terms of the key issues and some of the big continental initiatives and lines of effort that are being undertaken by both the African Union and the World Bank. Let's now turn to take a country-based perspective, look at how individual African countries are addressing the issue of accelerating digitization and economic development. And for that, I want to turn to Mr. Musa Jimo, who is the Director of Payment System Management Department at the Central Bank of Nigeria, where he also doubles as chairman of the Nigerian Electronic Fraud Forum. He has over 26 years of financial service industry experience. And what we would like to get from you, Mr. Jimo, is that country level perspective on the measures that Nigeria is taking in the digitization space, how this fits into the overall economic development plan for Nigeria, what you see as the key gaps and challenges, and then specifically for the central bank. What role is the central bank playing in Nigeria on developing some of those policies and regulatory measures that would facilitate economic inclusion and financial inclusion within the country? So Musa, over to you.
Thank you very much, Monday. The COVID-19 issue has brought about a new macroeconomic narrative, within the country, and I think the changes that are taking place this time around will become the new norm going forward. Now, in Nigeria, there's an improvement in ICT infrastructure within the last 2 decades that have spurred a new wave of digitization across the various sectors of the economy. Specifically, the financial service industry has seen growth in innovation, and operators have become highly diversified as fintechs are also clamoring for, a share of the market. There's a new program that the government launched about 2 years ago, which has to do with the smart Nigerian digital economy. We never anticipated that there was going to be a COVID, but it was a project that was aimed at, digitizing the economy and bringing a lot of small and medium enterprises into the digital space. The central bank also is involved in driving financial inclusion. We're one of the countries that are driving financial inclusion, and we have a financial inclusion strategy to raise the number of the unbanked, up to 95% by the year 2024. So that becomes a major concern for us. Now, with the things that have happened recently, we've seen that digitization has become a major compelling imperative for all Nigerians. With social distancing, a lot of Nigerians do not want to touch physical devices. Everybody wants to go virtual. Everybody wants to do transactions virtually without having physical interaction with bank branches and other financial touch points. Now, the key gaps and challenges that we have is the huge infrastructural gaps. As the country requires more investment in telecommunication infrastructure, not every nook and cranny of this country is fully digitized. We still have issues on infrastructure, where we have to provide power and internet access. So that's a major challenge for us. The other challenge within the country has to do with cybersecurity. A lot of people are very scared of even patronizing electronic transactions, afraid of adopting electronic transactions because they feel that their information is not safe and that they could be defrauded. So challenges of cybersecurity is a major one for Nigeria, which gracefully we have enacted an act called the Cybercrime Prohibition and Prevention Act, which will take care of the incidences of fraud and make sure that we tame down the fraudsters within the Nigerian cyberspace. Another key challenge is the building of expertise in the emerging ICT businesses. We have a lot of areas that we need to really build a lot of expertise across the spectrum of financial service providers within the country. I have to talk about big data, Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, and all that. We need a lot of skills to be able to build this in order to provide digital financial services to the unbanked and even those that are already banked in order to facilitate a digital economy. The 3 major priorities that we think will be necessary for enhancing our economic development has to do with, first, I talked about expanding the digital reach. So we need to come up with a digital inclusion strategy that will make sure that every vast majority of Nigeria will have access to internet network. We're also talking about identity. Identity is a major challenge in Nigeria. Every individual has to be identified. Today, the banks took up the initiative of providing a bank verification number to Nigerians, and well over 45 million of Nigerians already have that within the banking sector. But we need to bring other people that are outside of the financial system into the sector, which is why the federal government is also pursuing issuing the national identification number to all residents of Nigeria. believing that when this is done, it will basically resolve the identity issues that we have. If the government, for example, wants to reach individuals in Nigeria, the only way you can do that is to uniquely identify every individual and get across to them. We need to have this for Nigerians to be able to partake in financial service industry. Major recommendations that we would think can help us advance economic development and digital transformation within the Nigerian economy has to do with this identity management that I talked about. Now, what the central bank has done is to partner with other agencies to see how we can expand the network of agents, mobile money agents, bank agents within the country, where we can turn those outlets to financial touch points where individuals can actually go and enroll for bank verification number. And the national agency that is responsible for issuing identification number can also leverage on those outlets to issue the national identification number to Nigerians. So providing a vast network of financial touch points and agent outlets will also help in driving the identity management issues that we have. We have also, as a regulator, pushing for some initiatives that we think would spur the financial technology companies within the space, who we know will basically help us drive digitization within the financial space. And so we are coming out with the regulatory sandbox, open banking and open API, which we think will democratize access to financial services within the country. We also are setting up a cyber fusion center where discussions on cybersecurities, threat analysis, and a lot of things within the cyberspace can actually be analyzed to see how vulnerable we are and how we can tame down the incidence of cyber crime within the space. These are the three major recommendations that we are pushing and initiatives that we are pushing to ensure that we promote the economic digitization in Nigeria and I think at a larger pool in Africa. Thank you very much.
Mr. Jimo, I appreciate your input on that. I heard some really clear identifications on some of the gaps, but also a sense that Nigeria is focused on both the big picture. I heard you talking about the Smart Nigeria digital economy and some of the measures that are being taken to support that. That's a good thing. I also heard you talk about some of the measures and policies that the central bank is pushing and advancing. That's a good thing. You talked about three major challenges, and I would assume that these are challenges that would also be reflected in other African countries. Those were the lack of electricity and internet penetration to all corners of the countries. You talked about the cybersecurity challenges, and it's interesting that the cybersecurity challenges is now becoming a theme that we've heard from all the speakers that have gone before to now. And then you also talked about the importance of human skills development. That we can talk about the physical infrastructure, but that we also need to pay attention to the people who are actually going to be managing that infrastructure and using that infrastructure. So that soft skills part of it, the human skills development of it is really important. But let me just get back to you for 1 minute. For the uninitiated, could you tell us a little bit more about what you mean about the challenges of ID management in Nigeria?
Thank you very much. So in the banking sector, we have situations where a customer, for example, can have accounts in several banks. And so in each bank, the account holder is seen as an individual. Now, what we have done is to find a way where we can uniquely identify a customer so we can see the customer around the entire banking system. So if once we assign you a unique ID, we can actually see all the accounts and transactions that you have within the financial space. So to that extent, we implemented the bank verification number, the BVN, which has been implemented for over 45 million bank customers within Nigeria. Now, this has to go around. The banking population is over 95 million. A lot of Nigerians do not have bank accounts. And that's why the financial inclusion strategy is pushing to make sure that we bring more people within the space. Now, to achieve that, individuals need to be assigned this unique ID. And so what the bank is doing is to create outlets where Nigerians can actually go and get this unique number so that they can be registered into the financial space.
Okay.
That's the BVM project. There is also the government project of uniquely identifying every single Nigeria, every single resident in Nigeria, which is the national identification number, being managed by an agency called the Nigerian Identification Management Commission. These are the two major identity management projects that we are pursuing in Nigeria to make sure that every Nigeria is uniquely identified and they can have access to financial service within the country.
Thank you so much for giving us a little bit more background on that. And thank you for the points that you raised about where Nigeria is and where Nigeria hopes to go in the future. So let me now go from the international organizations. We've just had a perspective from a public official, so that government perspective. Let's get to the private sector here now. And I want to transition to Mr. Kennedy Mubita, who's head of the Africa head of Standard Chartered Ventures at Standard Chartered Bank. Many of us who are familiar with the landscape realize that Standard Chartered has a long history on the continent. And what we would like to hear from Mr. Mubita is, what is your assessment of the state of play for private sector efforts and innovations towards digitizing African economies? How can the private sector contribute to Africa's digital transformation and financial inclusion? And what are your top 3 recommendations for moving that agenda forward?
Thank you very much. I'll try and get through that in the next 5 minutes or so. So I'm going to encapsulate it a little bit.
Sure.
Of course, we've all talked about the benefits of digitization in Africa, in the sense that a lot of Africans who were never on the record, not known to exist, and most of the information rails were basically following the previous the centralized government processes, as well as relationships with the former colonial powers. The digital framework has enabled Africa to have an Africa-centric view of the continent in terms of where are the people, where do they live, and what they're doing, and so far has facilitated a lot of the payment services between people who were previously unbanked and bring them into the financial limelight, if I can call it that. But even in this digital journey, I'll point at 4 issues that I think basically reflect the state where we are. And though they may, so I'm trying not to frame it in a negative sense, because they are basically opportunities for us to develop the sector much better. The first thing is that so far, the private sector and the entities that are operating in the digital space in Africa are rather siloed, in the sense that, they're internally focused and not industry focused. And so and that will need to change, because over time, we will need to basically find industry solutions that meet the African continent. And because of this siloed mentality, what tends to happen is that some of the players in the sector use the digital knowledge they get, or the digital interaction, as a competitive advantage, rather than seeing it as a societal or developmental necessity that's going to happen and that's necessary for the continent, and therefore lift the entire continent up rather than lift themselves individually up. Thirdly, the regulators. And I think the regulators right now are kind of reactive, and I think the state of change has been so fast that the regulators they basically have found it difficult to catch up in terms of how quickly technology is evolving on the continent, and therefore, instead of using, and there's an opportunity now for regulators to start using technology and technology tools as a policy tool to achieve their objectives, rather than just as a risk mitigation tool to stop people from abusing the data. Finally, it's a data personalization. There are quite a few players in various countries, particularly the 4 major countries, who have actually taken a step forward in terms of implementing digital solutions, keeping client data, knowing the flows and the velocity of transactions on the mobile devices. But this data has been personalized, and therefore it's not available to other players who are coming into the space to see how they can leverage that to build products on top of that. And these are 4 key areas that I believe. My lights went off. African problem. Oops. Apologies for that. Just at the wrong time. The lights went off. But hopefully they'll stay on for some more time. Now, in terms of how we can use technology to improve the state of affairs in Africa, actually three key areas. One is access to markets. As I said earlier, most of the supply chains have been linked to Europe, and so you will find that somebody who has a use case in, say, Tanzania will import something from Europe when they could import it from Kenya because of lack of information. Digitization enables us to create new marketplaces and give new access to markets for people who are within the continent and be able to find products within their locality, and in so doing increase their volume of sales and optimize the fixed costs that they put in their ventures. The second thing that it can do is operational efficiency. We've been working with some SMEs in this sector where they do not have ERPs, they don't have records to maintain, and were not able to use the information that they've been able to get to basically improve their standing in front of financial sector players. And so we're seeing a lot of players coming into the space where they are creating financial bots, they're creating consultancy services on a digitized format, and this is an area which is actually growing in Africa. The final thing, of course, is access to credit. The ability to use digitally enhanced data to profile the users, because previously, as we mentioned earlier, a lot of Africans were not visible from the financial framework, but now digital platforms are able to give them visibility, not only to the sellers and buyers, but the financial institutions, insurance service providers, and so therefore increase the range of financial products and support services that they can receive to facilitate their business. So in terms of my three key suggestions that we would have is, one is we need to facilitate open innovation. And this can only be done by data democratization, being able to attribute the data points to that individual and enable them access the services that they're able to, given their financial status. And the last one is developing intra-Africa supply chains, as I had mentioned. So these are the three major suggestions I have: open innovation, data democratization, and the development of intra-Africa trade chains.
I really appreciate your presentation. I'm just in awe at all the different points that all the speakers have made and continue to make, and just enrich this debate. A number of things stood out from your presentation, at least to me. You talked about the silos that are getting in the way of really expanding this digitization, and that we need to rethink how we break down those silos to facilitate digital knowledge. Instead of hoarding that digital knowledge, how do we change the framework so that we look at that digital knowledge as a public good that facilitates development for all across the continent? So transforming that outlook is one of the things we're going to have to invest in. You talked about reactive regulatory frameworks rather than proactive frameworks that move from approaching their work as risk mitigation to more approaching their work as a facilitator of development through digitization. And so those two things should not be mutually exclusive. I think you can do both. But how do we get countries to look at the second piece of it? You also talked about the personalization of data. I think that's really important. You raised the key point for me, which was, if we digitize Africa, what we're going to get is access to markets within the continent. What we're going to get is access to new markets within the continent. And I think this is a key point, particularly if you put it within the context of the Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is never going to realize its full potential unless we get this digital part right as well. So thank you so much. And that applies to the supply chains that you were talking about as well. And I liked your points about enhancing operational efficiencies and access to credit. And then the other things that you mentioned that I think stood out for me was democratizing data and facilitating innovation on the continent. That those are also factors that we need to look into a little bit more seriously if we're really going to realize the full potential about what digitization can do for African economies, African people, and overall African development. So thank you very much for that, Kennedy. I appreciate your input. So we've just heard from Kennedy, large multinational corporation with a long history on the African continent within the private sector. What I'd like to do now is to take another perspective from the private sector and from a company, a privately owned company that, as Congresswoman mentioned, has been working really hard on issues of financial inclusion in Africa. And I'm delighted to introduce our partner for this event, Ms. Viola Llewellyn, who's the co-founder and president of Avamba Solutions, who will speak to us on the same points as Mr. Mubita, but really from that small private company perspective, your assessment of the state of play for private sector efforts and innovations towards digitizing African economies, and how the private sector can contribute to Africa's digital transformation. And then, like all preceding speakers, Viola, please give us your top 3 recommendations on how we might be able to accelerate these efforts. So Viola, over to you.
Monday, thank you so much. We are very excited and honored to be co-hosting this event with the Wilton Center's Africa program, and a big thank you to all of you on the panel who joined us. What makes me very excited about this particular topic is not just in light of the COVID-19, but to see such a synergistic relationship between everything that has been said so far. Now, from a policy standpoint, many innovators do take their cues from not just the problems on the ground, but by what regulatory frameworks make some of those innovations possible and applicable. And I'm going to try to be as specific on a one-to-one basis to everything that we've heard here today. We are always very concerned with the access to market, especially in light of distancing. It's almost impossible to ask the informal sector to not sit outside underneath umbrellas. But there is a role to play from the central banks and the financial institutions and those of us that innovate products and solutions to them to find ways to elevate these individuals into business options and opportunities that will give them access to the new digital economy. We believe that the challenges and the opportunities that need to be taken into consideration start with digital finance, not just the currencies. There's a challenge in that not everybody has a bank account, but those that do have quickly discovered that the interaction between their mobile wallets and their digital cash do not quite connect to their bank accounts. That may be the case in East Africa, but from a Francophone standpoint, Central Africa specifically, there are broken pieces where these silos continue to exist. We have an issue with the way the legal frameworks operate within a contractual basis. It would be very difficult to continue digitized trade when entire regions don't accept PDFs or a digital signature. We have fundamentally deep issues that make the ideology of digitizing Africa exciting, but there are many things that need to be resolved. I was very taken with the deep way in which the Central Bank of Nigeria addressed the issue of identification. That goes hand in hand with, if you have identification, at some point, those of us that innovate biosecurity from facial recognition, which is difficult for Black faces, it's been a fact, to fingerprinting, voice recognition, and how to integrate those in such a way that companies like Avamba can support the central bank with enhancing that particular initiative. I listened to the AU, very exciting, but we now have, again, access to markets are going to be exciting, but only if cross-border trade is something that already exists in the non-digital world. It would appear to us that everything that divides us is actually the answer and the solution to how Africa can take advantage of a digital future, especially in light of COVID-19. Yes, it's true. We are going to want to stay out of banks, But if your RMs are at home accessing their teams by Zoom or whatever digital communication platform they have, how do we connect that to productivity so that central banks, and other regulators can see the effectiveness of how this is working and can resolve the gaps that are left behind when you have to also account for fraud? How do you know that a customer is going to continue to get integrated and financial inclusion when they can't even speak to the bank operatives, let alone go into the bank? How can we make sure that digitization affects those people who previously couldn't get access to credit, but were doing informal business on the trade front? This goes back to the wonderful things that are happening out of the African Free Trade Agreement and the Free Trade Zone. The digital platform is the answer to cross-border manufacturing, cross-border trade between Africans with Africans for goods that have been created underneath our very feet. Now, the great opportunity here in a digital Africa after COVID-19 is the fact that we also are in an era where oil is not going to be the only source of secondary markets and trade and business. These opportunities will rise up as new sectors. We have the ability to take a look at the broken supply chains and realize it's time to take digital applications to manufacturing on the ground. That means from whatever is coming out of the ground to whatever is being manufactured to whatever is being transported and traded. I was making some notes listening to everybody. The healthcare system is subject to digitization at this moment in time. There will be another epidemic at some point. We survived Ebola quite well. COVID-19 has 1% of the cases are in the African continent, but we will have to use ways in which to analyze that data to protect ourselves. We're often not the cause of some of these global disruptions, but we're definitely the recipient of most of the impact. Transportation, logistics, and travel can be digitized to keep us safe. The innovations that come out of companies that are looking at this need to create some sort of an African open source capability where the data is in repositories that can be accessed by those that are doing responsible innovation. Sandboxes with central banks and with healthcare and other ministries could never be more crucial than they are right now. To be able to give, let's say, the central bank a dashboard by which they're collecting continuous feeds from those people who are doing lending or alternative lending is a way in which their policies can be supported. These are the things that we are looking at, really microscopic levels of where are these innovations coming from and what are the future impacts. Luckily, because of AI, we can extrapolate and we can predict. This is where the leapfrog capabilities of Africa will literally save the world. If we can apply AI to what we have done and look at the patternistic opportunities in that, then we would have done our jobs as Africans in a post-COVID-19 world with all of the digital tools that are available. Our focus has truly been about how do we create sustainable wealth using digital solutions. And that's where banks, central banks, people like Standard Chartered, especially with their own completely innovative approach to sharing sandboxing and the best that has to offer becomes important. I think that the top three for me in wrapping up are to open up modern manufacturing. That is going to be the greatest way in which to restart our economies, not just from the things that we make, but all of the secondary education that comes out of moving us from just classic education to something that is vocational so that people can create. The digital cross-border trade and partnerships on a large scale and on a smaller scale to make sure that the opportunities filter down to the last milers. If we do not teach people what digitization actually means and what's in it for them, they won't want to participate in this journey. And we all have a responsibility for making sure that that happens. And then also, more than anything, the regulatory framework to have within it some sort of a reward system that isn't just about let us not just punitively, but restrict innovation until we understand it, because those cycles take way too long. there is such a mismatch between the regulatory response, the legal frameworks, and even the customer adoption of technology, which could be completely streamlined if there was wherewithal and if there was a vocal and visible response from the regulator to say, these are the techniques and the structures and the products that are best going to drive whatever siloed industry that they are trying to address. So I think I'll leave it from there. I've been eagerly listening to everything that everybody has to say here. And I know that this is an important opportunity, because with every war, there has to be an advance guard. And the advance guard here in a COVID-19 world are those who have been innovating and will continue to innovate for when we get past these first few waves of unfortunate impacts and deaths to the realities of the economies that we're trying to build. We need that advance guard, and the digital solution is that.
Thank you so much, Viola. A lot there. You know, a number of things that stood out. You reinforced a number of points that previous speakers had made. But I want to talk about this, the legal system that you talked about and how that needs to catch up with our aspirations and what needs to happen if we're going to use digitization to transform Africa, and really about closing the gap between the regulatory framework, the legal framework, and the customer adoption of technology as an area that we need to focus on. You also talked about the broken supply chains. And I think that's really, really an important point, because you see this all over the continent. Yeah. And that is another area that I thought was really important. And your point about developing an African open source capability, I really hope somebody takes this on, because that really has the potential to amplify and really fast track what we were trying to do, so that we are not taking as long to go searching for information and replicating stuff that has already been done. And so I think developing that capability is going to be key. I mean, there's a whole lot more in your presentation, but in the interest of getting to the Q&As with the audience, let me turn now to my colleague and friend, Meg King, who is the Director of the Science and Technology Innovation Program here at the Wilson Center. She also serves as the Strategic and National Security Advisor to the Wilson Center CEO and President, Congresswoman Jane Harman. Meg, your program does some really incredible, interesting, and informative work on digitization, artificial intelligence, and a whole lot of other technology issues. And I know that your work is not specifically Africa focused, but what I thought it would be good for us to have you share with us some lessons from other regions on what has worked in this space, what has not, and some of the key challenges that maybe African countries ought to be thinking about as they move forward with their efforts at digitization. That I think some of the lessons and experiences that you can share with us from other regions might be applicable, even or customized to suit Africa's situation. So Meg, over to you.
Thank you, Monday, for including me in this conversation. I spent quite a few years working in East and Southern Africa, so I'm no stranger to the continent. I saw firsthand how technologies work and how they fail miserably. And it's not always intuitive why that is unless you've seen it in practice. So Viola, I want to echo Monday's comments. You've got it exactly right. And I'll kind of get to that in a minute. I think there's a model we might be able to use to address a lot of the things you mentioned. And so I'll get to that in a minute. But rather than large formal schemes, I suggested as leaders of African nations consider how best to ensure the implementation of some of these new digital initiatives. They've got to find ways to adapt existing trade agreements, which include some of those legal protections you're mentioning, Viola, and develop specific innovation strategies and security strategies. All themes that most of the presenters today have discussed. We've got to break down those silos, as has been mentioned, and data does need to be democratized in order for Africa to make the most advantage of the capabilities that exist today and that can be improved. In North America, the newly ratified US, Mexico, Canada trade deal is the first of its kind in the world to include a digital trade chapter. It removes barriers and adds protections so more products and services can be bought and sold online. Admittedly, this chapter was apparently adopted from the TPP trade deal, which never materialized. But this is now actually a trade deal, and it's worth taking a little time to think about how it might be adopted in the African context. Some of the things it does were mentioned on this session earlier. It requires each nation to accept electronic signatures on contracts, which is not a highly technical solution. It's possible. It creates a duty-free internet for importing or exporting digital products, like think stream music or games, or and it's similar to the concept of duty-free shopping in an airport. It also protects intellectual property like source code and algorithms so that businesses feel comfortable trading rapidly. I don't believe the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement includes these digital provisions yet, but implementers should look at the USMCA model and consider adopting some of these ideas like digital contracts and the sharing of government data, as was just mentioned in the open source conversation. One of the key provisions here, and again, it has just been ratified, so we don't know how implementation will work, but the agreement in North America requires that the government share the data they have, and each of the countries in this region have very different data sets that can be very useful. A lot of healthcare data, a lot of data about minorities that the United States, for example, doesn't have, a lot of data about trade, about who lives where, who buys what. And my example is that the California DMV, the Department of Motor Vehicles, registers those in the state who want to drive motor vehicles, is actually allowed legally to sell the data that they obtain, and they earn somewhere in the range of $50 million a year. So obviously verifiable data like that is really important, and it's an asset. On a country by country basis, those that have seen real innovation progress, I'm thinking like Canada, which is home of the neural network. There's been some talk about artificial intelligence. The neural network has been responsible for so many of the advances we've seen in the last 5 years on that front. And France, which has a thriving startup culture, have developed concrete strategies for implementing new enabling technologies. And enabling technologies are a lot of the things that we've discussed today, those that can help really drive change, and especially cultural adoption. And support existing processes. So everything from like agriculture to e-government, and it also addresses specific barriers like outdated tax laws. But you can't use some of these capabilities, AI being one of them, without basic infrastructure in place. So some of the lower tech things governments can do, from obtaining more internet connectivity to skills training, are critical to address first in some of these strategies that nations and hopefully the region will take into consideration. Digital payments are obviously a big target for criminals. One of the big reasons is because of how these payments occur. A lot of them use text messaging, and these text messages can be intercepted and manipulated fairly easily by cyber bad actors. And then there are the corruption problems like digital smurfing, in which dirty money is given to runners in small amounts that don't trigger money laundering reporting requirements and are then directed to transfer to accounts controlled by organized crime. In North America, we've seen the same problem, but it ironically was a little bit less tech savvy in that gift cards were used to move the money illicitly. And so this is another example of how Africa has leapfrogged, but also faces a similar security challenge. And so there are some best practices that we've learned in the financial fraud sector that could be implemented between the telecoms, between the digital payment providers, and between governments. And they're going to have to work together at that level to address this problem. It will never happen at the grassroots level. And the digital identity schemes are going to be critical going forward. They were mentioned earlier on the call, and they don't have to be, again, highly complicated. As there are some best practices already in the region, the banking identification concept mentioned in Nigeria earlier might be used as a model. Perhaps some countries will want to use the same kinds of identities used by banks. Some will want to adapt different ones or piggyback on them. But in whatever way the countries in the region decide to move forward, digital identity will be the way to push through the security as well as the innovation issues. There are countries like Estonia that have developed entire e-governments where you vote online, you register online, you have a digital identification number. That's helpful in a small scale context, perhaps in a country by country arena, but as I've seen on the African continent, you've got to start from the basics and make sure that there's connectivity first and that people understand how to use this and that there are skill sets available before you can get to that point. And so I'd just like to wrap up by saying that there are also many consumer privacy schemes around the world, and Africa has been adopting similar ones to the global general, data protection regulations that Europe led a few years ago. Kenya has one, a couple of other countries do too. And consumer privacy and protection is really important for users and to enable markets. If a user doesn't feel comfortable sharing their data, their location data, they won't be able to use these tools. And so the combination of innovation, security, and consumer privacy and protection will be critical going forward. But there are ways to do that and models to look at, as I mentioned, Canada, France, and North America. So with that, I'll give it a
Thank you so much, Meg. That was absolutely wonderful. I think you touched on some really important points that we can or should be thinking about as we move forward with digitization efforts in Africa. I think it was important to hear you reinforce the issue about implementing existing approaches and strategies that have been put in place. So this is not about creating new things in many aspects, but there's already, how do you take what you have and implement that so you can move the agenda forward? I think that's a reminder of that, because sometimes when you look ahead, things can seem overwhelming because you think you have to start from ground zero, when in fact there is so much that you could build on and leverage. So thank you very much for that. I really liked your point about the digital component within the trade agreement. I wasn't aware of that. And I'm not sure whether the Continental Free Trade Agreement, the African one, has that in place, but I think that's something that we would have to interrogate, because it's really at the heart of pushing forward with Africa's enhancing intra-African trade and therefore development. And if we're talking digitization, it's important to have that element in the agreement. So Mr. Yadali, I do hope you are listening and you heard that. And then the verification of data, and you talked about data protection and consumer privacy, and also talked about the vulnerability, especially around digital payments and some of the best practices that exist for managing fraud and corruption. And you reinforce the efforts that Nigeria, for instance, is taken in terms of that digital identity schemes. And so this has been really, really rich, and I just wish we could go on and hear from all of you. But we have a few minutes left, and what I would like to do is get in some audience questions. But let me turn first to Congresswoman Harman and see if she has a question for us today or for the speakers.
Thank you, Monday. I have been watching this call with great interest and learning a lot. I always learn a lot. I'm a digital adapter, so I'm pretty pathetic with technology. Meg will tell you chapter and verse of my meltdowns. But at any rate, I did understand most of this conversation. First, I want to say how proud I am of the smart people at the Wilson Center, you in particular, Monday, and Meg King. This was a rich discussion in part because of your contributions, but also somebody chose the visionaries who presented information from Africa, and all of you were very interesting. So here's my question. A well-known political type in America named Rahm Emanuel was the chief of staff to President Obama for a while, and then he was mayor of Chicago. And he always said, and I think I'm remembering correctly, don't let a crisis go to waste. This coronavirus crisis is gigantic. It is all over the world. It has turned our world upside down. But all of you suggested ways that Africa could, didn't say would, accelerate through the crisis and become a digital platform, which would be fantastic. Africa will have, I have learned this from my friend Monday, the highest birth rate in the world. But I think between now and 2050, she'll correct me if I got this wrong, but I think African population, at least Southern African population, will double. My point is this: you're huge. You're going to be huger. Could we actually think about, without being, lunatics, the notion that Africa could lead the world in accelerating through this crisis to become the digital continent? Am I nuts, or is this a possible dream that could be achieved?
Let me turn to Mr. Yadali and Tim to go first on that question. So Yadali first.
Do you hear me now?
Yes, we hear you.
This is a very great question, and even if I may say, I cannot predict exactly what's going to happen in the future. I wish and I really believe strongly that will be the case if Africa really, as most of our leaders are thinking now about digitalization, if our leaders really will get into the digitalization and create the whole enabling environment for it and make it as a priority, Africa will really lead them all. Because we don't have those constraints that most of the society do have at this point of time. So we are free of, how can I say, prejudice. And therefore, since we don't have really any binding conditions that prevent us from really going into digitalization, we will be embracing that very well. And the example has been happening in Africa. The first, actually, the growth of mobile and the mobile fintech really started in Africa. So basically what is being applied now in the world in terms of fintech mainly started in Africa. So with that, I am sure, and I respond that I strongly believe, and I strongly believe that this will happen sooner or later, but with one condition: if our leadership really would take the digitalization as the top priority of their way of addressing our socioeconomic development. Over to you.
No comment?
Hi. Yeah, just to perhaps add to what Jane said about Rav Emanuel saying you should never waste a good crisis. I think actually Winston Churchill, my compatriot, said it a few decades earlier, and he certainly had some big crises to deal with in his career. Yeah, I think there are at least 2 or 3 areas in which Africa can do digital leapfrogging. One would be in terms of a cashless society. My local bread shop, for instance, no longer accepts payments in shillings here in Kenya, and insists on using either M-Pesa or credit cards. Secondly, education. I think education is really a sector, particularly higher education, is really a sector which is longing, in a sense, for a greater use of open educational resources and greater use of online learning. And I think we're seeing that at the moment. And then thirdly, obviously health. That's very much the core of our thinking at the moment. And I think Africa also has a chance to leapfrog in areas like health management information systems, telemedicine, remote learning, etc. So I think there are certainly areas in which we can not let this crisis go to waste. Thanks.
Thank you, Tim. Let me turn to a couple of audience questions that we've just received, but also let me remind the audience that's tuning in that you can tweet or email us questions. It would be remiss if we did not address the gender dimension of this, the topic we're discussing today. So we have a question here from Julia Lala Maharaj, OBE, founder of Orchid Project. And she says, could you put on the gender challenges that digitizing the African continent highlights? Given how important it is to communicate to household level, can women and girls be reached through the digital gender divide? So let me do this. Musa, let me turn to you first. Make sure that you have policies and regulatory frameworks that account for that gender divide is very important. And then I want to ask the same questions of Kennedy and Viola. So Musa, can you take that question first on the gender divide?
Sorry, can you repeat? Your line was actually breaking.
Oh, sorry. The question was, could you comment on the challenges that digitizing the African continent highlights, and given how important it is to communicate to households with the digital gender divide?
Yeah, apologies. Everything was breaking, but if I understand it correctly, it's about what the Nigerian government can do in order to make sure that gender equality is maintained within the financial divide, right? Okay. One of the main actions that we've taken is through the financial inclusion strategy, where in capturing the household information and data, we try to identify. We make gender data very, very much important in order to see how many of female and male components of the data are actually excluded from the financial services. So that's the major component of the data that we capture. And also in the enrollment process of the BVN, we also ensure that gender is captured, basically to see the divide across, the various communities in Nigeria. What the federal government is doing currently as a result of this COVID is to send some palliative, to some household. Practically, I think they have identified over 3 million households that they actually want to send palliatives to, and they're actually using this data, to stratify how they can reach those individual households. And they're looking, and I think the pattern has to do with the vulnerable areas. And so this information that we're able to gather from the financial inclusion assessment, where we capture, data and identify practically the gender to know the number of male and female that are excluded, is one of the key components that they use to drive the palliative. Sorry, the line was breaking all through. I just couldn't hear you very well.
That's all right. We got your response. Let me turn the same question over to Kennedy. If you can give us just what does that gender divide in the digital space look like from your perspective? And what are some of the things that we can do to bridge that digital gender divide? And then Viola, after Kennedy's done, would you take the same question and see if you have a different perspective on that?
No, actually, from my perspective, and that's why actually I came across Viola, the digitization has actually helped in terms of rebalance the gender divide. Most of the people coming to, or the fintechs coming to our lab and accelerator lab to look at new products and new solutions have actually been ladies, surprisingly. Currently, I have a team of about 6 people, and I have 1 gentleman and 5 ladies working for me, and it's growing. And in fact, one of the challenges I'm getting is really trying to rebalance that and getting some gentlemen on. But having said that, of course, overall the community is still very, very male dominated, and I'm seeing a shift in this space in terms of the people interested in solving some of the societal problems, where some of the issues that I mentioned earlier in terms of personalization of data and not looking at the social benefit of technology. I do find some of the discussions, and I'm sorry if this sounds sexist, but more on the ladies' side, because I find that the societal, delivering the societal solutions, digital solutions to solve societal problems has been very well done with the ladies in the teams and in the marketplace. And this is evident in the Kenyan market, and I'm sure Tim would maybe add to that. Maybe he has experienced this as well.
Absolutely, I mirror your comments. After all, I'm a woman in a digitally led technology company. Ever since the doors have been thrown open to the awareness of how differently women lead, even in the non-digital world, I have seen it trickle down into the bravery and the ambitions of young women who I come into contact with, who want to resolve the world's problems. There is a certain level of anonymity that comes along with being able to sit behind a computer and code. There is the opportunity to not be judged by gender when coming to the table with ideas that actually resolve an issue and can be monetized. I feel that, and I have seen quite deeply that with every workshop I've attended, even groups like Active Spaces, which is led by Rebecca and Non-Chong, the women are leading the way in using digital solutions to resolve problems. Ovamba's own portfolio of customers who we fund with alternative trade products, the best performances in there are by women who saw an opening for, I no longer need to come in with a land title. I can get addressed and I can be measured according to my intrinsic ability to run my business. There's the opportunity to grow and beyond the treasury limits that I would have seen. So it's affecting many different areas in which women have wanted to either participate and be heard. And it's also affecting how women want to raise their children, which is something else that I've discovered in many closed door conversations about what will digital opportunities do for you as an African. And it means that I can run a business from home. I can cut down on how much it costs to pay for daycare. I can experiment and fail privately, because that is what is necessary when you are in the digital world. Not everything you do is going to work, but the internal learnings from those missteps are the equity that you put into the solutions that you'll take to the broader market. Using the technology to raise your children and help them to learn the outside world through other things other than their physical senses is something that many mothers are beginning to take advantage of. This could not be a better time for closing the gender divide with digital solutions.
All right, thank you so much. Let me do this. We have 10 minutes remaining. I want to read 4 questions that we have received, and then I'll give you each a minute to respond to one of the 4 questions, whichever one that you choose, and then we will wrap this thing up. So here are the 4 questions that we have received. 1, how is Africa skilling its youth to leverage the opportunities in the digital economy? 2, how are governments as the linchpin to digitization in Africa adapting emerging technology to better serve their citizens? 3, what has been the gender focus of the digital transformation drive by African governments? So adding on to the earlier question. And then 4, could the panelists please say a few more words about the status of digitally based personal credit scoring platforms in Africa, platforms such as TransUnion and Equifax in the US? Efforts are being made to put this in place and expand their coverage. How would these contribute to commercial growth? And hang on a second, I just need to move down my screen. How would this contribute to commercial growth, and what are the principal constraints to putting these in place? So I'm literally just going to go down in the order in which you actually reverse the order in which you spoke. So start with Meg first and then move it up. So Meg, over to you.
Great. Probably the last person you should call in first, but I can talk a bit about the experience of, I'll take the Equifax and the credit monitoring. I don't have a specific experience on the continent, but I do have some insight into what Asia has been doing and how those models have been imported into North America. So there's actually been, despite the concern about bias and transparency as artificial intelligence tools are used to help lenders understand whether or not to lend to a particular person, there's concern about, if that person doesn't have enough data, if they don't have enough history, they might be deprived a loan because they don't have proof that they could pay back that loan. There are some new kind of zero-based algorithms that are coming out of lenders in Asia, for example, where you don't actually have to have credit score. There's a tool in the US now called Affirm, where you can go online, it's kind of a bit on the honest honorary kind of honorary code sort of model where you input your income and what kind of a small loan amount you would like, and then based on a few quick triggers, are you registered in some way with a criminal complaint against you and a couple of other similar factors, then you automatically get a small base loan. And so there are ways to kind of progress through this big credit score concept, which is actually very less useful these days than it was in the past. So the credit score of yesterday will most likely probably go away, and what we're looking more towards, unless it's a very big purchase like a home or something much larger than that. And what we're looking at more and more with more lending and actually apparently higher repayment levels are those very quick assessments about if you've got any criminal records, if you've got any of the big major red flags, and if you have enough income to cover whatever small loan you have. So there are opportunities there to kind of move past the bias issue and move past the data issue and make it easier and faster.
Meg, Viola, I think over to you.
I have no idea what TransUnion, Equifax, or the others are doing in Africa, but I do know that Ovamba has a massive database that we have been collecting the risk performances of customers in alternative trade based on what they buy, how they sell it, right down to the SKU as a way of tracing and tracking economic activity and getting an understanding of what sort of risk should be shared with that customer and how creditworthy they are, which is something that we are looking for ways to make available to banks to help them to get financial inclusion to the informal sector, who probably do not show up on the radars that their traditional credit scoring skills are looking for. I would imagine that TransUnion and the rest of them, if they came into our space, will meet the same challenges because these individuals do not have a position in anything that is centralized that you can go and conveniently look at a very convenient database. Those things are hard to find. So that is our perspective, and that's how we deal with that. We've been building our own for the last 5-6 years. Now, governments, the little I know about governments in the Central African Cameroon region where I am, they're not actually doing very much about that. The day an African government has an actual department or a minister for digital or technology or financial inclusion, which I believe Sierra Leone has at the moment,
Yes.
is the day in which we will begin to see a systematic standardization of things like intellectual property, especially for the youth who are designing and creating products and solutions, that they can start to get some sort of even social credit for saying you contribute to the economy. You may not even be at a revenue generating status, but you are recognized as an implementer in this area. So I haven't seen this happen yet, would like to see it happen. And then the last thing is, how are we skilling the youth? We need to start to bring alongside traditional education something that is vocational and get the children, even as young as 2 and 3, who now know how to tap a screen, to be part of that and have that as a continuum. So those are my answers to these things.
All right, thank you so much. I just got the 2-minute warning. So what I'm going to do is for final 3 speakers, I'll give you about 30 seconds each to just give us your closing thoughts on any one of the issues that was raised. So
I'll go first.
Kennedy, what did I, yeah, please, Kennedy.
Yeah, I'll go first. I'll speak to the education of the kids. I mean, I think what's happening is that most of the learning is self-learning right now because people are seeing the opportunity. I think a more formal learning program and education programs up to university, tertiary level must be introduced to the universities.
Thank you. Thank you. Tim?
Yeah, we've gone from a situation where kids at school can't take their mobile phones into school to a situation in which they can only learn through their mobile phones. So I think that's actually quite optimistic for the future of Africa's youth. Thanks.
Thank you. Musa?
Let me unmute myself. Because...
So you have 30 seconds.
Yeah, for me, I think the best way to approach it is to have create vocational, incentive for students, such that when they come on vacations, they can go into co-creation hubs and be supported to come up, with some of the initiatives that they have, giving them access to computer services and and a lot of, if I may call it, free internet access, if that is possible. So you have to create a village where they can actually go and experiment some of the ideas that they have. Providing such environment, we actually encourage the youth in building the skills.
Thank you. Mukta, you have the final word.
Thank you very much. Yes, that's an honor. But I just quickly, two things wanted to say. The African continent is the most youthful continent today in the world, and therefore not digital transformation can happen without the youth. Digital transformation cannot happen if the leadership really are not taking it at the highest level possible and connected. But also we cannot go without really mitigating the negative effect of the digitalization, because we haven't mentioned that. There are things we have to take care of. We need to be very inclusive and impactful on what we are doing with regard to digitalization.
Thank you so much to you. I think a really, really good and deep discussion about the challenges, but also the opportunities that exist for digitizing and transforming. And so I thank all of you for bringing your knowledge and expertise to this issue. It's given us a lot to build on. I see this as the beginning or the foundation of a much longer, you have given us the food and the fuel with which to carry forward the discussion and facilitate this agenda. And thank you to all of the participants as well for tuning in. We will be continuing this discussion. Megan and I have some ideas in Africa. Thank you, Congresswoman, for joining us and getting us off to such a fantastic start. And thank you to the Africa Program team and the Wilson Center team for all of your support in making this discussion possible. And with that, I bid you all goodbye. And thank you so much, Viola, for the partnership with Ovamba Solutions.
It was an honor to co-host with you. Best regards from all of our leadership team and the team in Cameroon and Ivory Coast, and wishing everybody safe and health to you and your families, and hope that we will come out the other side. We will meet again.
Thank you. All right. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you, Jared.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Thanks.